Chapter 8 Corrigan Lark's Carnival of Wonders. Haille and Katlyn hitched rides on carts hauling pumpkins, squash, and other fruits of the harvest. Haille's favorite carts were those stuffed with mounds of hay. It made it easy to wrap himself in his cloak, lay back on the cuttings, and let the vibration of the cart rock him into a shallow doze. He would wake to the sun winking at him through branches of trees splashed with the colors of autumn, wine, amber, and ochre, rich colors that brought to mind the exotic inks of the folio page that he kept folded in his tunic. At night they slept in thickets, haylofts, or fields not yet harvested. Neither of them felt comfortable staying in a room full of strangers at an inn, especially with a bag of gold capinas between them. The first night they shivered on opposite sides of the small fire, but by the second night they slept side by side for the sake of warmth. Katlyn had packed the rucksacks with water skins, salted beef, and stale bread, so they did not want for food in those first few days. She had even hung a small kettle for boiling water on the outside of her bag. Haille thought it impractical, but the first night she boiled water and added pine needles to make tea, he was grateful. He went to sleep warm and congratulating himself on his choice of traveling companion. The trade road, the main artery for east-west travel, was busy at this time of year, and Haille was confident they blended in well with the traders, villagers, and other children skipping a day at the schoolhouse in order to help their parents in the fields.
"We'll have to be careful as we get further east. We might even want to avoid the trade road altogether,"
Katlyn said.
"You know slavers like to snatch unattended children."
"The Eastlands are truly wild," Haille said. "That is a good idea. Maybe we could find a trade convoy headed to Rivertown. I'd be willing to wait a few days until one came along."
"Good. We don't want to end up in leg irons on a slaver bound to Malthorpe."
"Unless Avenger Red would save us," Haille said.
"I'd rather not be in a situation where I'm placing my hopes on an outlaw."
"True, but she is an outlaw that stands up for justice. She's a hero." Katlyn made a pocket of air with her cheek and blew out, but said nothing more. On the fourth day the weather turned against them with endless driving rain that stopped most traffic on the trade road and soaked Haille and Katlyn through to their underclothes, forcing them to ask a farmer for lodging in his barn until the rains passed. Katlyn thought it best not to flash their gold about, so they offered to pay for their stay with labor. The farmer was grateful, and so they spent the next 2 days cleaning out stalls. The first day Haille was eager for the work. It kept them from being idle and fought off the cold with exertion. But by the second day he was chafing to be on the move once more. On the third day, despite the threatening clouds, they set off on foot. The walking was slow, the trade route muddy. Their boots were soon heavy with layers of the stuff and the hems of their cloaks filthy. The rain returned, and between Browntree and Kinth the farmhouses were few, so their clothes, dried just the day before, were sodden again. After leagues of wordless travel, their lips blue, their heads and shoulders hung low against the cold, they came upon the outskirts of the township of Kinth. The rain had finally stopped, and the sun setting in the west cast its rays on the colorful tents of a traveling carnival pitched in a fallow field. Torches lit pathways between tents. Music, laughter, and the cries of children drifted through the evening air to them. "I don't know about you, but I could use a carnival about now," Haille said.
"What if we are seen? People may be looking for us by now."
"There are too many people there for us to stick out. We'll blend in fine. After all, don't you want a hot meal?" Katlyn did not argue, but by the look in her face and the way she frowned, Haille guessed that she wanted to travel on. Before she could change her mind, or his, he tugged on her tunic and said, "Come on, what harm could there be?" Corrigan Lark's Carnival of Wonders, as the signboard at the gate read, was a feast for the senses. After long days of relentless travel they soaked in its delights. Haille found a money changer, and they exchanged 2 capinas for a stack of pence that they could spend without attracting notice. The first thing they sought was hot food, indulging in roasted chicken on a stick, bacon, and strawberry rhubarb pie. Katlyn helped herself to a cup of hot cider while Haille tried a flagon of ale, which made his head swim and his thoughts feel loose, but generally made his spirits soar in a way they had not in some time. Coming to the carnival seemed the best idea yet, and the night was full of possibilities. their journey fruitful, their goal within reach. Haille found himself feeling optimistic about the future. A news crier passed by them announcing news of the kingdom, but most revelers paid little attention.
Refugees from our sister kingdom Carif flee to Rivertown to avoid fighting in the south. The king promises aid. In the Eastlands, Avenger Red continues to elude capture and act as the bane of child slavers.
See, Avenger Red is a hero, Haille said, poking Katlyn. He was not sure why it was so important for him in that moment to be right, but it was. Katlyn ignored him, wiping the sides of her mouth free of strawberry rhubarb filling. Jugglers tossed pins, then swords, then burning brands between them. Magicians performed sleights of hand, making chicken eggs appear between their fingers and then baby chicks from their sleeves. Jesters jousted, riding on pigs in a mud pit, and strong men challenged each other to arm wrestling matches. All this while, food sellers peddled food roasted on skewers and trinket dealers waved jewelry and medicinal herbs in the air. Inquisitors paid close attention to the trinkets and medicines. Haille noticed them for the first time since leaving the city. They were clad in gray cloaks with yellow surcoats beneath. They stalked the winding pathways among the tents, the torchlight revealing faces bereft of merriment and full of suspicion. They carried satchels over their shoulders that held heavy tomes full of laws and regulations. Not that they needed them, for each could quote the edicts of Hilary Hilburn by heart. More often than not, the books were to show the accused the law they had broken, if they could read. The Eastlands and carnivals especially were places known for superstition. Haille would not have been surprised if in a tent set off from the rest, old women were reading fortunes or casting spells. But in the main thoroughfares all was lawful, the herbs for sale sanctioned, the trinkets for vanity's sake, not talismans, and the magicians were illusionists, nothing more. The inquisitors made sure of that. Haille and Katlyn came to a tent for face painting. Katlyn had hers painted to look like a cat. Haille, reluctant to look foolish, chose only to have his forearm painted with a bolt of lightning. Next door was a tent of animal wonders, but the proprietor was passed out in the doorway, a web of beer foam stuck to his beard. The stench of unwashed animals and filthy cages was overwhelming, even outside the tent, so they decided to move on to the next, largest tent of all, a tent with a sign that read, "Dramatic Performances." They each paid 3 pence to enter, but the show was worth the expense. The performers were even better than those outside. A magician caused a rabbit to disappear into a hat, then multiply into 4 when he turned it over. Tumblers twisted their bodies into impossible positions and using one another as springboards leapt through the air in displays of acrobatics. But by far, the jester, who came out last, had the crowd laughing the most. Haille thought the jokes from the wild-haired, short man in a motley striped costume were the funniest he had heard in his life. He struggled to breathe, his stomach ached, and he nearly fell over more than once. Katlyn did not find the jokes as funny as he, but Haille didn't care. His worries had flown away, his heart felt light, and the laughter free and overflowing. Haille wanted more ale, for he was sure it had something to do with his mood, and he wanted more of this. Happiness. The jester was doing impersonations when Haille started to look for another drink. Katlyn was saying something about it not being a good idea, but he ignored her, his attention already split between the jester, his next impersonation, and more drink.
"And who am I?"
the jester called out as he began another act. This time his body went rigid as a board before he tipped over on the floor, shaking and writhing like a fish out of water, spit flowing from his mouth as he banged his head on the boards. A voice cried out, "The prince! The prince!" and the crowd exploded with laughter. As a final flourish, the jester opened his breeches, held his member between his fingers, and sent a stream of urine onto his own thrashing legs. The laughter could not reach greater heights. Haille's hands trembled. The tent, for all its size, felt small, hot, confining. His vision blurred, and somehow he pushed through the laughing fools all around him to the edge where he found the flap and ducked under into the cool night air. Everything came back to him, in equal and opposite force to the happiness he had just felt moments before. He was in his father's study again, kneeling amongst the letters, his father's own hand accusing him of being deficient, defective, a disappointment. The tents, the torches, the people all became a shining mess of color. He stumbled, barely able to line one foot up with another until he fell upon his knees in a patch of mud, crying uncontrollably. He wept for only a few moments before he was enveloped in a hug, arms wrapped tightly around him and a voice in his ear. "I'm sorry, Haille. I'm sorry. There." His annoyance with Katlyn evaporated. Now he leaned his head on her shoulder and cried until he had no more tears left and could only cough and sniff. All the times he had wept in Yana's arms came to mind. He felt safe in Katlyn's as well.
"Aye, leave some room there for decency's sake,"
a woman's voice said from above them. Before Haille could even look up, a firm but small hand yanked them apart. Katlyn dropped back onto her rump, and Haille tottered backwards, tripped over a tent rope and dropped on his rear as well. Over them stood two inquisitors, a young man with raven hair and a lean face and an older woman with severe grey locks and leathery skin.
"You are much too young for such embracing. Where are your parents?"
Haille looked at Katlyn, too shocked to answer with her standby story that they were siblings journeying east to help their relatives with the harvest. Katlyn was speechless as well, her eyes wide with fear, her face blanched. The younger of the two inquisitors took their hesitation for disrespect. He bent down, grabbed Katlyn under the arm and dragged her to her feet.
"Madame Pallas asks you— Wait, what is this?"
the young man said, changing his tone mid-sentence as he gripped Katlyn's upper arm. Katlyn became ferocious, swinging and hitting the man in the belt. He dodged, struck her across the face, stunning her, then whipped her cloak back, took the sides of her tunic at the shoulder and ripped them apart. Katlyn cried out for help, but when the passerby saw the grey and yellow of the inquisitors, they turned their faces away and kept to their own business. Katlyn's upper arm was exposed, and on her bare flesh was a silver band, intricately carved to appear like a coiled, sleeping dragon. Its limbs spinning like burning suns, its tail curling around to mingle with the tongues of flame leaping from its mouth. In the spaces between the slithering body were runes of meaning and origin lost on Haille, except that he knew they resembled some of the writings he had seen in the banned books of the occult section of the library.
"Blast it! If that is not contraband, I don't know what is,"
the young man said. Madame Pallas bent over, cupped the band in her hand, and shook Katlyn so that her teeth clacked.
"Where did you get this? Don't you know these are forbidden?"
"Run," Katlyn said.
"What is that?"
the woman said.
"Run!"
Haille realized she wasn't speaking to the woman, but warning him. What happened next came about too fast for Haille to react. Instead he stared, agog, as Katlyn reached beneath the flap of her tunic with her free hand, drew a knife, and whipped the blade across the woman's cheek. Hot drops of blood landed on Haille's face. The woman let out a terrible screech. The younger inquisitor was struck dumb as Haille. Katlyn took advantage. She punched the knife into his thigh. He dropped to the ground, clutching his leg, while Katlyn grabbed Haille, her own torn clothes flapping wildly with her movement, and shouted once more, "Run!" They sprinted between tents, ducking under and jumping over ropes. Haille tripped on a tent stake, and as he scrambled up he looked backwards to see both inquisitors following. A bright red gash weeping blood down the cheek of the woman, and the young man limping along behind her. Haille and Katlyn had no plan. They shared no thought but the impulse to flee. The tents provided twists and turns enough that they were able to lose the inquisitors for the space of a few breaths. But as soon as they stopped to rest, their hands on their knees, their chests heaving, Madame Pallas came around a tent and cried out,
"They're here!"
They started off again, crossing the main thoroughfare and weaving between couples, families, and packs of children. For a few blessed moments they were hidden by the crowd, but people were staring at them wide-eyed, especially at Katlyn, her hair disheveled, her tunic ripped, and a bloody knife clutched in her fist. Haille yanked her back between two tents just as Madame Pallas emerged from a crowd of stunned onlookers. "We need to hide," Haille said between deep breaths. The air was foul. He wondered if they were near a stable or pigsty. "Here," Katlyn said, sheathing her knife, dropping to the ground and rolling beneath the edge of the nearest tent. Haille followed, then froze on the other side, his sleeve to his nose, as footsteps passed just on the outside of the tent. The stench was even worse now, and Haille recognized it. The tent of animal wonders. It was already dark outside, but the inside of the tent was even darker. All but one of the lanterns had been allowed to burn out. There was no one touring the inside. Haille imagined customers were turned away by the sight of the proprietor passed out in the entryway. Not to mention the stench. The cages were arranged in a circle along the outer walls. The exception was one large cage looming in the center of the room next to the tent pole. Madame Pallas called out to her apprentice just on the opposite side of the canvas wall. Haille prepared to run for the entrance, but her footsteps receded, followed by the grunts and uneven footfalls of her limping apprentice. Albino bats, two-headed turtles, and three-legged goats stared back at him from cages with the wary look of animals often beaten. Haille was wondering how long they could hide there when he thought he heard a new voice behind him. He turned but only saw Katlyn staring into the largest cage. "What did you say?" Haille whispered. Katlyn did not answer, but something big, moved in the cage. It looked to be the size of a horse, but was a gaunt horse if that. Haille came alongside Katlyn. "This is terrible," she said, not taking her eyes from the creature within. Closer, Haille could see it was no horse, but an elk. Its fur was missing in patches as if from mange, and in places its skin was healing from lashes of a whip. Its knees were red and weeping from ducking down in a cage too short for it. The upper bars were nicked and scratched from antlers that gleamed like metal rather than the bony substance most antlers were made from. "Come on, we have to hide," Haille said. "No," Katlyn said. "We need to free these animals. You just stabbed an inquisitor. Are you crazy? What is that thing on your arm?" She yanked her upper arm out of his grasp and ignored him. Instead, she darted to the entrance of the tent and started to drag something across the ground. "Come on, help me!" Haille came to her side and realized she was pulling at the arm of the passed-out animal master. He grunted and stirred in his stupor. Haille cursed under his breath, went to the man's belt, and found a ring of keys before ducking back into the fetid darkness of the tent. "Here, but," was all he said before Katlyn swiped the keys and set about trying them in all the locks. She tried the center cage first, the elk rising up behind the door, its hooves and its antlers banging against the bars. "Katlyn, are you sure this is a good idea?" Katlyn dashed to the outer cages where she met with immediate success, turning the key and setting free a sleek black fox with red eyes. A barn owl followed, next a cage full of ferrets, then the two-headed turtle. The three-legged goat needed help out of its cage. After lifting it, Katlyn shook the cage of the albino bat so that they fluttered out and circled in the air at the apex of the tent. Haille stood staring at the growing chaos, the fox slipping past his feet. The elk slammed against the bars of its cage, its eyes gleaming at Haille like two radiant moons. The cage still held. "This ought to do it," Katlyn said from beside him, heaving up a hammer for driving tent stakes into the ground. Before Haille could protest, she brought it down on the lock holding the elk in its cage. Sparks flew in the darkness, incandescent as if from a blacksmith's hammer. A woman screamed outside as the bats shot out through the main flap of the tent. Katlyn struck the lock again while the elk rocked the cage and raked its antlers against the bars. More sparks rained down. The beast huffed, grunted, and bellowed. Katlyn took 2 steps backwards, ran at the cage with a cry, throwing her entire body into the swing, her ripped tunic opening and the strange band on her arm catching the little light left, almost as if it were glowing. This time the lock swung sideways and opened like a broken jaw. The door exploded outward, just missing Katlyn's head. She tottered backwards, crashing into Haille. He grabbed hold of her, but they both fell to the floor. Drawn by the commotion, Madame Pallas appeared at the entrance just in time for the elk to leap into her and knock her flat on her back. More screams followed from outside. Haille pulled Katlyn to her feet, and they scrambled for the far side of the tent where they had entered. Haille lifted the flap to roll under the tent again, but a hand grabbed his wrist and a voice called out, "Got you!" The apprentice dragged him out from under the edge of the tent and started calling to Madame Pallas inside. "The other one is in here," she answered back. Haille struggled, but the apprentice was much bigger and, even wounded, he was stronger. Haille thought to kick him in his thigh where he was still bleeding, but he didn't need to. The apprentice's eyes grew wide, and Haille heard the approach of hoofbeats. The elk rounded the corner and made a charge directly at the apprentice. The young man let go of Haille and dove aside. Katlyn rolled under the tent next, and then the elk did something else queer. It lowered its rack of antlers to the nearest line holding up the tent and snapped it with one of the sharp edges. The side of the tent collapsed with a rush of air and a flutter of canvas. The elk did the same thing to the next rope and the next until the tent was completely deflating, with Madame Pallas struggling beneath. Even the apprentice was too dumbstruck to act. The elk shook its head, dropped its antlers down, and snapped the lines to the next tent. There were screams erupting all around them as bystanders fled and tents crumpled. Chaos was good cover, and Haille and Katlyn quickly scanned for the nearest path out.
"That is one smart animal," Katlyn said.
"Then he is smart enough to fend for himself. Let's get out of here," Haille said.